Thank you, musicians. Hello. Well, we left last lesson, and we had a question. I discussed what arbitrary meant in terms of human language, and now I'm going to apply that a little bit better to math, so that we can understand it. Is math an arbitrary game? Arbitrary. Once again, arbitrary means that we just randomly assign characteristics or names and characteristics to things. A chair doesn't need to be a chair, like I said last time. Anyway, so here's the premise. If mathematics is an arbitrary creation, the mathematical concepts and rules are not something that correspond to reality in any way, but instead are simply created and given meaning by the people that create them. Okay, so think about that for a second. This is completely the opposite of mathematical realism. Instead, what this is saying is math does not exist. It does not exist at all. Okay, let's not look at the discussion of how you can apply it to build like the beautiful Acropolis or something like that. But instead, let's just run with the argument. Perhaps math is an arbitrary exactly like language. So, now take a look at this. This is an abacus, as you see. Oh, nice that. This is an abacus, as you see, and it says down here, why is there no zero bead on this Chinese abacus? Why is there no zero bead? Wait a second. Now, I don't know if you know how abacuses really work, but they're actually quite cool. What you have here is you have 5 little beads. That would be 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And if you have 1 up, that means you're on the first 5. And if you have 2 up, that means you're on the second 5, namely 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So on each of those little categories, or each of those little, I guess you could say, rows, represent 10. So 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, a million, 10 million, 100 million, a billion, 10 billion, 100 billion, a trillion, 10 trillion. You can count up to 10 trillion on abacus. And as far as I know, that probably did pretty much anything you needed to do at a market. I don't know if they ever had 10 trillion of anything at a market. Maybe rice grains? No idea. But so what you see is you have a very, very effective and very, very simple tool for calculating. So is it possible that math was created to accommodate the needs of the people? Okay. Now think about this for a second. I can make an argument that time does not exist. All right? The universe has no beginning. Well, we say it's with a Big Bang, but something had to be there, so something came before the Big Bang. But let's just, for the sake of the argument, let's say the universe has no beginning, and it has no end. I mean, energy always exists, right? So something must have always existed. But let's say, for the sake of argument, it has no beginning, no end. Then is there really any passing of time? It's just a timeless universe. And you've heard that before, and you've never really thought about it, but the universe is timeless. So enter the finite human being of, 100 years, if we're lucky. But all of a sudden, we have a time. And we need to facilitate, I guess you could say, interactions with one another in society. And so when we say, okay, we're going to freeze to death this winter if we don't build a storehouse for our grain. So let's build a storehouse. All right? Okay. Well, I mean, if we didn't have time, then people would just randomly show up whenever and nobody would be there. They had to agree upon some form of a concept of time at dawn. We'll be here at dawn. And it probably started like that, but eventually we needed more specifics than dawn because your dawn and my dawn might, be a little bit different. So we said 6 o'clock. We'll be here at 6 o'clock. Fine. And so all of a sudden we have this concept of time which we can't really even escape. Nevertheless, so you can make the argument that that's just an arbitrary creation to facilitate navigation through our environment. And so, very similar to math. Why is there no zero on this bead? Think about it. I talked about it 2 lessons ago. But think about it for a second. Why do we need a zero? You're not counting zero at a market. They have zero as a placeholder. Remember, zero has 2 different functions.
0 is a placeholder, but that's just a placeholder. It's not the same thing as 0. 0 can denote nothingness, and 0 is a placeholder. Don't think about them as the same thing, because they could simply be different symbols. The Babylonians had something like that for a placeholder. Gigs, I think. 0 was created, apparently, discovered, created, whatever you want to call it, at 628 AD from Brahmagupta, an Indian guy. And then it didn't get into Western mathematics until the 12th century. I said 11th century a lesson a couple times ago, but it's 12th century. I meant 1100s, but I messed it up. Anyway, okay? So, in the beginning, positive numbers. We needed positive numbers because, I mean, it comes like this. Think about it for a second. We have a more complicated society. If we're just running around, we're cavemen and we eat and we're like, we don't collect anything, or, we're just like, something like that. And then you eat and you're hungry, and then you are not hungry after you eat, and then you don't really go look for food. I mean, but once we start getting a more complicated society, we start thinking, okay, we have commerce. And not everybody can do everything. Okay, one of the greatest things that human civilization did is we diversified our labor. In the beginning, everybody did everything. Everybody's going and doing everything, getting food and building a shelter or whatever, okay? But all of a sudden, you start diversifying society. We don't need everybody to go collect food. We need some people to collect firewood. We need some people to secure the shelter. We need some people. So people have these jobs, all right? And all of a sudden, some people, like for instance, start breeding goats. Some people grow rice and millet and grain. Some people are builders. Some people are, all kinds of stuff, butchers, whatever. And so all of a sudden, once you have a more complicated society, you start needing to put some form of a value on these things. Because I'm not going to give one goat for one small sack of millet. A small sack of millet is not worth as much as a goat. It isn't. Goats cost more to feed than a sack of millet. I mean, I would be losing. So all of a sudden, there's a value system put upon things. We need to be able to have commerce, and to be able to have markets, and to be able to have a society which diversifies labor, we have to put a value system on different types of labor. What's the butcher worth? I mean, you can't just go chew on a goat. I guess you could, but somebody needs to butcher it up. Maybe somebody's better at it. Or, rabbits or carrots or whatever the case is. All of a sudden you have all these different things that people are doing, and we need a common language to be able to value those things. Enter the numbers, positive numbers. Think about that for a second. So how many sacks of millet is a goat worth? Well, let's say a goat eats, before he's ready for slaughter, let's say a goat eats 10 sacks of millet before he's ready for slaughter. I don't know, I know nothing about goats. Okay? Well, you at least have to get 10 sacks of millet, but you want a little bit of a profit for your time, because your time is worth something too. So let's say the going rate is 15 sacks of millet for one goat. Like I said, no idea. But then all of a sudden we have 15 sacks of millet, one goat, you have a value system, and you have an ability to do commerce that people agree upon. Maybe you'll go down to 14 sacks of millet if he buys 10 goats, I don't know. But you don't need negative numbers. You don't need a 0 to be able to do this. 0 doesn't even come into people's mindset. It's a necessity. It's a strange philosophical abstraction. Much later, other complex elements like 0 were added. All of a sudden, we needed 0. How about if you have debt? Think when we start getting banking. You borrowed, 1,000 gold pieces. Let's call them shekels. You borrowed 1,000 shekels from a bank, okay? Or from somebody who is a banker. All right, well, all of a sudden, you need something which is in between a plus and a minus, because all of a sudden you're minus. And you don't get back into the plus until you pay everything back. So you have to have this concept of a 0 somewhere in between, where we denote nothingness. It's an abstract concept of nothingness. Nothing isn't anything. And if you want something funny to think about, maybe nothing doesn't exist until we define it. And then it's not nothing anymore because we've defined it. But that strange point aside, nothing doesn't exist. I mean, by nature of what it is. So we don't need to represent it as anything. But when we start getting into a more complicated situation, like for instance, debt, then all of a sudden we need a zero because it's necessary for our interactions. It's created. It's convenient. It's an axiomatic understanding, like what are the properties of zero? We have to determine because there's no natural sort of property of zero. I mean, why can you, I mean, you know you can times by zero, but why can't you divide by zero? Think about that for a moment. Everybody tells you from, whenever, as soon as you learn division, you can't divide by zero. Well, why? Well, just you can't. Well, why? You just can't, because your teacher probably didn't know either. And but it's just one of those things. Now, in a later lesson, I'm going to show you exactly one of the problems of dividing by zero, so you kind of understand the problems with it. But anyway, okay? But there's axiomatic values that we just arbitrarily put upon the characteristics of zero, or what the zero is, the characteristics. Anyway, it's changed at will. Logic itself can be changed. Now, here's some more here that are coming up. Negative numbers. All right, what is a negative number? That's a really weird, arbitrary thing. Negative numbers, where do those even exist? Negative numbers do not exist. They're a concept which we've created. Irrational numbers, that's not even a number at all. Think about that for a second. Not even a number, an irrational number. 2 divided by 3, 0.66666666, and it goes on forever. Ah! Even out of the screen. It goes on so far that it's out of the screen. Oh, let me get back to my oasis. I like it over here. It's nice, how cozy. Let me have a seat. Whew. That was a tough run. Whew. Let me have a grape. They're a little chewy. All right, anyway, so irrational numbers. What is it? It goes on forever. It's not even really a number. How can that exist? How can 0.666 for all eternity even exist in the first place? It doesn't. Imaginary numbers. I mean, it's the square root of -1. We've heard all our life in math that you can't possibly times 2 negative numbers together and get a negative number. It's a positive number. But no, wait. Imaginary numbers, square root of -1. How does that happen? I wish I could answer it for you. I don't really know. All I do know is that this was a quirky thing that somebody kind of invented, I guess. It was a quirky thing they didn't really have any use for, kind of like a zero, until we got into encryption. And apparently it puts a whole other dimension in the complications of encryption that makes it really hard to crack. And so again, I don't really understand it, but you see the nature of what's going on here. And so mathematics changes and evolves with the needs of society. As society becomes more complex, so does the demands put upon mathematics. And it's fascinating. It's really interesting. And I hope you're starting to see at this point how philosophical math really is. We don't think about it as philosophy, but it's complete philosophy. It's a philosophical thing. Kind of just a computation, a logical thought process. It's fascinating. And new mathematics are developed to deal with the needs. When we need new things, we develop new mathematics to be able to deal with it. Does this mean math exists? That's the question. Does it subsequently exist? Does hope exist? Does inspiration exist? Does love exist? If they do exist, where do they exist? Maybe the answer lies in the fact that if math exists, it exists along with human culture. That somehow our human culture brings math into existence by the way we think. Now, the fact that you can apply math to reality, like send a spaceship up and yada, 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 the fact that you can do that's something different. We're going to talk about it later. It's really quite fascinating. I mean, because you have applied mathematics and you have pure mathematics, which is food for a later lesson. But anyway, so it is a good question. And that is where I leave you. So thank you for joining my little oasis. Oh, it's beautiful. I can't wait to sit back down. And so, a little bit of outro music will do as well. So, please, have a nice rest of your day and your journey. And be sure to beware of bandits. Musicians,